Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series unlocking the mysteries of science in China. It's a tale of triumph, defeat, and the struggle to regain past glory. Journey deep inside these ancient walls in search of the genius that was China. In our final episode, China's leaders sought to import Western technology, but not Western ideas, a distinction their people would not accept. In the wake of the battles, the question persists, will the dragon rise again?
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
Shenzhen, the People's Republic of China. In 1979, Shenzhen was a tiny agricultural village near Hong Kong. Today it is home to 500,000 people. With its billboards and high-tech skyline, it could be any city, anywhere. But this is China, and in Shenzhen, the Chinese seem comfortable at last with the process of technological and economic change. China's strongman, Deng Xiaoping, launched the economic reforms that made Shenzhen possible in 1978. His goal was to transform China into a modern economy by the year 2000. For a decade, the Chinese bought all the Western technology they could lay their hands on. It was an aggressive attempt to import the tools with which the capitalist world had built its unprecedented wealth and power. Modern factories equipped with the latest machines from Japan, Europe, and the United States turned out consumer goods for export and for sale at home. It was a radical departure from the Spartan policies of Mao's China. Mao may be spinning in his grave, but Chinese television now airs commercials, like this one for a state electronics firm. Deng and his colleagues accepted the notion that Chinese tastes and fashions might change as the economy opened up, but they still tried to draw one line. Western-style consumerism was acceptable, but Western democratic ideas were not. But could the two be kept separate? The challenge came here, Tiananmen Square, before the gates of the old Forbidden City. In 1989, the students of Beijing seized the square, rallying to the call for political change. The students argued that progress, science, technology, economic growth could only flourish in an open society. Such dangerous ideas led ultimately to a violent confrontation with the regime, in the renewal of a conflict that lies deep within Chinese history. In a rare interview granted Nova in 1987, dissident scientist Fang Liji explained.
If we simply try to adopt new technology from abroad without changing our traditional social and economic institutions, we will fail again, as we have done so often in the past. Advanced technology in Western countries is related to their economic and social systems. Only if the Chinese system is changed, and by change I mean greater freedom from bureaucratic control and more democracy, will China have the ability to absorb this advanced technology.
Amid the calm rhythms of life in rural China, the battles of Tiananmen Square seem impossibly distant, as they always have. Imperial China, at its height, was an empire of great power. It was ruled by an institution unique in the medieval world, a bureaucracy of men selected for their mastery of China's classical literature, who served an emperor called the Son of Heaven. The imperial officials created the most scientifically advanced culture in the world. But for the Chinese bureaucrat, science was a hobby. Governing the state was the highest priority. Still, the Chinese accomplished great feats of technical skill, like the construction of the complex waterways that irrigated the plains of China. This one, still in use today, was begun 2,000 years ago. The Chinese were among the greatest astronomers of the ancient world. They explored magnetism and invented the compass. The Chinese produced the world's first printed books and published everything from religious texts to detailed works of medical knowledge. They even invented that most basic tool of power, gunpowder. But though the Chinese built quite deadly weapons, the Europeans improved them as they battled among themselves. So when China and the West finally collided in the 19th century, the Celestial Kingdom found itself defenseless against the impact of modern military technology. The humiliation of the Chinese by men they considered foreign barbarians led to the collapse of the world's most stable empire. The last rulers of Imperial China clung to the images of their past and themselves faded out of history. China's defeat reverberated throughout Asia. As far back as the 7th century, Japan had borrowed from China ideas, institutions, even styles of art. But when the Western nations displayed their power in the 19th century, the Japanese broke away from the Chinese example. The ancient trappings of the Japanese emperor gave way to the uniform of a Western constitutional monarch. And in the drive to modernize as quickly as possible, the Japanese people followed suit. Japan so successfully mastered Western technology that within decades it supplanted China as the dominant Asian power, which led first to tension and then to open conflict. In the 1930s, the armed forces of Japan mounted a devastating attack on China. The persistent Chinese failure to come to grips with the modern technology of war left them unable to defend themselves against Japan's superior weapons and tactics. And yet, the Second World War was a disaster for Japan as well. In the rubble left behind after the war, China and Japan each confronted a desperate task of reconstruction. As they rebuilt, both nations sought Western science and technology, but they did so following very different paths, with consequences that echo today. This was China in 1949. After a bitter and bloody civil war, the Chinese Communist Party, under Mao Zedong, completed its stunning victory over the American-backed nationalists. Mao and the other communist leaders had spent years in their caves at Yan'an. Now they looked over their new domain from the balconies of Tiananmen Square, where the emperors of China used to pass.
Marxism really came to China through victory in war. And then, of course, once it had won, then it appealed very much to all the other instincts of the Chinese. Unity. A united China, a central state that the Chinese have been accustomed to for so many centuries, in place of chaos and anarchy, which seemed to accompany liberalism and all the freedoms that other Western ideas had emphasized. Instead, it was something solid, strong, with a clear set of principles and ideals, with a clear goal, and asking the Chinese people to follow, and arousing their idealism and their willingness to commit themselves to this revolutionary ideal. In that sense, it replaced Confucianism, a new ideology for all, as it were. And this new one was inspiring in even more ways than the old one. The old one had looked tired and aged, but this one was new, fresh.
In 1950, Mao flew to Moscow to seek Russian aid and advice. Stalin offered only a small loan of $300 million, but sweetened the deal with an enormous commitment of experts and technology to construct the new China. The Chinese built power stations, steel mills, factories, all from Russian plans. The Russian model was large, urban, with an emphasis on centralized heavy industry. Propaganda films emphasize the mythic side of the links between the early Russian and the Chinese revolutions. The symbolism highlighted Lenin's role as the guide to all socialist revolutions. Chinese assimilation of the Russian model was so complete that China even imported the ideologically sound, though scientifically absurd, Russian biological doctrines.
I cannot teach what I learned in America. I had to teach in the Russian way because we were learning from Russia then. The Russian form of science, I first thing, I don't know much about that. And then the things said in the textbooks didn't seem to be real science, some of that. It didn't seem to be real science to me, but I had to teach it.
Mao himself chafed at the master-pupil relationship he felt with the Russians and began to distrust all experts, both Russian and Chinese, for the challenge they could pose to party authority. In the mid-1950s, Mao began to seek a purely Chinese road to economic and industrial growth. Ignoring Russian advice to go slow, he pushed ahead with full-scale collectivization. The entire country was organized into 26,000 industrial and agricultural communes in 1958, part of an almost feverish push to develop quickly. Commune life was painted in glowing colors, the better to persuade peasants who had only just received their own plots of land to hand back that land and join the collective enterprise. This cartoon depicts the happy life at Dajai Brigade, China's showplace, which was actually propped up with army help. With propaganda and coercion, and with the force of his vision of a socialist state built by hand by the new socialist man, Mao did succeed in mobilizing the Chinese peasantry. Just as the early emperors of China drafted the able-bodied into seasonal forced labor, vast armies of peasants were swept up into a frenzy of construction.
Mao always felt that if you unleashed the Chinese people, they would achieve miracles. This is a very important concept in any third world country, because you have to change your attitude to, from one in which you are dominated by nature to one in which you can see that you can shape nature. He always went to excess. The case of the Four Pests campaign was one example. He decided that healthcare was vital. He was right. He said, we will eradicate the four pests: sparrows, mice, mosquitoes, and flies. And in the case of sparrows, the Chinese went out on the streets of their cities, they beat gongs, they made noises, the sparrows were frightened, they flew around until they were exhausted, fell to the ground, and were killed. The result was a massive insect infestation, and the insects destroyed the crops that the Chinese were trying to protect from the sparrows. So the following year, they changed sparrows as a pest to bedbugs.
Other campaigns were more successful. A parasite carried by a tiny snail that lives in irrigation canals causes the debilitating disease of schistosomiasis. Using minimal technology, the snails were collected and the disease largely controlled. With the success of such campaigns, Mao came to believe that China could propel itself into the first rank of industrial nations. In 1958, he launched what was called the Great Leap Forward, to industrialize every corner of the country. 600,000 backyard furnaces were built to smelt iron, but they produced metal of such poor quality that only 1/3 could be used. Meanwhile, peasants making iron weren't growing crops. Grain reserves fell, and in 1960, the harvest failed. In the resulting famine, between 20 and 30 million people died. Nikita Khrushchev openly attacked Mao for his failure to follow the Soviet model. Relations deteriorated, and in 1961, Russian engineers and advisors packed up their blueprints and went home.
Certainly when the Russians left, industry was a shambles. I've been into factories where you can see virtually the fault line when the Russians walked out, and they've had to patch it up and tie it together with string and bits of old leather to keep it going. And in many ways, you could say that the Chinese managed well out of that. But Mao then built it into a necessity, but also it was something with which I think he felt much more comfortable, because that was withdrawing to peasant solutions and not really answering perhaps the much more difficult challenges that were being faced across the water in Japan.
In fact, Mao's failure appeared in its worst light when compared with what had happened to China's wartime enemy, Japan. By 1945, Japan was even more devastated than China. When the American occupation began, there were people literally starving in the streets. The commander of the occupation forces, General Douglas MacArthur, set out to create a new Japan, at once free and incapable ever again of waging war. The occupation forces had to rebuild Japan's economy, reorganizing its businesses and encouraging the institutions that Americans believed essential to democracy. Japan's military government had destroyed the fledgling trade union movement in the 1930s. But during the occupation, the unions re-emerged with American support. Union activity was viewed by the Americans then as a key device with which to build democratic values. However, as the unions became more active, strikes became common and increasingly violent. And, wary of the rise of socialism in Asia, MacArthur ordered in the troops.
Now, this was all heightened during the Korean War, when we had a major war with the communist powers right next door to Japan. And Japan was seen as being practically on the front line between East and West, and a very important country in that way. And so Japan began to loom in American minds as being something more than just a country to be reformed, but a country to be made part of the defense lines of the West against the communist East.
The Japanese built munitions for the forces in Korea, and the speed with which Japan re-industrialized reflected its historical ability to utilize foreign technology. Japan's automobile industry was on its way back. Here, Nissan displays its range of trucks and cars built from American designs. As China had with the Russians, Japan too copied its foreign model in exquisite detail. And Japan used its links to the United States with great skill. In the early 1950s, Japan's electronics industry was about to begin its remarkable rise. These two men, Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka, were pioneers. Their company produced this, Japan's first tape recorder, which used the vacuum tube technology of the day. But in 1949, Bratton, Bardeen, and Shockley developed the transistor at Bell Labs. In 1952, in the face of skepticism from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, Morita flew to the U.S. to purchase a license to produce the new devices in Japan.
Well, Morita is successful in America. And in 1953, the Totsuko company is in a position to go to MITI asking for the funds, the foreign exchange required, $25,000, to bring the technology into Japan. So far, so good. But MITI, at this time, is innately conservative and worried about the loss of foreign exchange. So MITI holds back on the deal. And the two corporations have to get together, signing contracts and making commitments. And only after that does the finance come through from MITI and the seal of approval stamped on the deal. Now, what is interesting here is that this is really the foundation of the Sony Corporation. And this is the creation also of a consumer electronics revolution based on the installation of the transistor into a small portable radio and into, later on, into television sets. So there must have been people who were kicking themselves. In the States, the American executives, in Japan, the bureaucrats who had foreseen that the transistor might be useful, for hearing aids. The truth of the story then, the importance of the story, is that Japanese corporate endeavor was, at least at these points, ahead of American corporate endeavor and ahead of the Japanese government itself. This is very important. And it's at a time when the label made in Japan is a symbol in the West of all that is shoddy, all that is cheap, positively nasty in industrial production.
It became Japan's highest priority to overcome this reputation in order to compete successfully in the international market. They were compelled not just to produce cheaper, but better products.
街頭には豪勢なテレビカーも出現。街から街へテレビの普及に大活躍です。
The key to doing this was presented to the Japanese by an American engineer named Dr. Edward Deming. Deming developed the notion of scientific quality control to improve arms production during the Second World War. He taught his Japanese students that the manufacture of any product could be rationally improved over time using a system of mathematical analysis. It was this message that the Japanese took to heart.
In the United States, there was a readiness to self-deceive with ideas about becoming a post-industrial society, a service economy, and there was the immediate and continuing prospect of making it nicely and plenty of profit in the marketplace with conventional methods. Therefore, as the Japanese adopted the Deming idea of quality control and made it systematic for whole production systems, it became a way of optimizing the productivity of labor and the productivity of capital as well. But American firms just didn't bother. Neither did European counterparts. So you have to come back to the point that in Japanese industry, there was an imperative to make it well by excellence in production, because that's all they had to trade off with to the rest of the world.
Deming's system of quality control involved monitoring every stage of the production process. It could be applied to any assembly line, manufacturing any product. But Deming's ideas required the commitment of both managers and workers, and it was here that Japan possessed its greatest edge. For Japan still possessed its reserve of experienced and well-educated people trained in its pre-war industries, the very people that China had in such short supply. Nevertheless, by the early 1960s, China had made some headway in its efforts to mechanize and modernize without Russian help. This factory originally built and repaired large tractors from Russian designs. Such behemoths were virtually useless amid the tiny fields and delicate waterways of the Chinese countryside. The factory is now devoted full-time to the production of a very different machine, the famous Chinese walking tractor. Two engineers at the factory, working with a technical institute in Shanghai, developed the tractor, known locally as an iron cow.
A local work unit leader told us that if we could actually do it in 3 months, he would fry a fish on his hand. We couldn't pass up the challenge, so we all worked very hard and finished in less than 3 months. Then we drove one of our tractors over to his commune, and because he couldn't fry a fish on his hand, he had to serve us a big fish for lunch.
The walking tractor is virtually the archetype of what we now call appropriate technology. It is simple to build, durable, and almost endlessly flexible. When it was introduced to the Chinese peasant, it became almost immediately the tool of all work, as it remains today. But the Chinese in the 1960s also attempted to develop expertise at the cutting edge of science. In 1961, China set out to build its own atomic bomb. In 1963, the Soviet Union and the United States signed a test ban treaty, which they hoped would help prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. But the Chinese refused to join the international accord. Nonetheless, neither the Russians nor the Americans expected the Chinese to be able to build a device as complicated as an atomic bomb without outside assistance. In fact, it took the Chinese just 3 years to do it. On October 16th, 1964, the Chinese Army conducted its first atomic bomb test. The successful test stunned people all over the world. But to Chairman Mao, the implication of membership in the Atomic Club was obvious. China was now a superpower. He said, "We have the spiritual atomic bomb, which is impossible for the enemy to acquire. And we also have the material atomic bomb. No enemy can defeat us. If the imperialists dare to impose war on our heads, we will finally break the sinews and bones of the aggressors and thoroughly and completely destroy all of them." However, the bomb tests so proudly documented revealed the gap between specific technical achievements and a broader application of science as China prepared its cavalry for the nuclear battlefield. The pattern was the same in the pure sciences. For example, a team led by Dr. Y.C. Du synthesized insulin in 1966. It was a major discovery at that time. But Mao retained his basic distrust of experts, and the most important consequence of the insulin discovery was to spare Dr. Du's laboratory from the ravages that were about to strike China's intellectual and scientific establishment. The failure of the Great Leap Forward had forced Chairman Mao to relinquish some of his power. And in 1966, he reasserted his claim to primacy in China with his last campaign, the Great People's Cultural Revolution. Mao called on China's youth to purge the party of counter-revolutionaries, and they responded by the millions. Children formed themselves into Red Guard battalions. Mao's thoughts in the Little Red Book were elevated to the status of a sacred text. The schools and universities were shut down, and with the slogan, "Better read than expert," the students launched their attack on the party, intellectuals, and eventually each other. Scholars were paraded through the streets wearing dunces' caps. The despised experts were sent out to the countryside, and a whole generation of Chinese scientists and thinkers lost their most productive years. The Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 to 1976. It ravaged the lives of 80 million people, 10% of the population. By the end of the decade, China was bloodied, exhausted, and economically stagnant.
I went into literally hundreds of factories in that period, and many of these factories were not working. There was enormous absenteeism. And the sum of it all was that Mao had forced this political mechanism which he used of moving the society forward by political campaigns. He'd forced it to an absolute limit where people were exhausted, to a point where never again in this generation, and possibly for a couple of generations, will a Chinese government be able to motivate people by ideology or by political campaigns or by that whole mechanism that was the foundation of Mao's political modus operandi?
The Cultural Revolution ended with Mao's death in 1976. And within 2 years, his old rival, the more pragmatic Deng Xiaoping, had reclaimed power. And with it, he set out once and for all to transform China into an advanced society by the year 2000. A key component of his plan was to open the door to some private enterprise. New markets were established to sell produce grown on private agricultural plots. Cash, in short supply during the Cultural Revolution, began to change hands faster and faster. With the heady rush of economic change, demands for political reform were heard. In 1979, posters on what became known as Democracy Wall called for political liberalization to accompany the new economic order. Deng shut down Democracy Wall within a year, but his economic program pressed forward, especially in the small towns of rural China, which had remained quite poor under Mao's collectivization. Here in Xinjiang, Fujian province, they've been making pottery since Marco Polo's time. The specialty here isn't the high art of Chinese porcelain. Rather, this is a factory town, mass-producing everyday ceramics. While Mao was alive, the work here was consolidated into this state factory. But with the economic reforms, private pottery workshops sprung up throughout Xinjiang, 500 of them within a decade. The new companies were so successful that the state factory began to lose money, and there was even talk of shutting it down. Instead, the state factory itself was made a kind of private concern, an umbrella organization leasing its kilns and studios to private contractors. By 1987, an annual loss of 75,000 yuan had become a profit of 200,000. The impact on the rural economy around Xinjiang was dramatic. Throughout the town, everyone seemed to be building. Evidence of the wealth that flowed into some parts of the countryside during 10 years of Deng's reforms. Because houses can now be inherited, the lavish ones reflect what can be thought of as Mao's worst nightmare, the re-emergence of distinctions of wealth and status. This mansion was built by the leader of one of the state factory's 3 production teams. Such conspicuous consumption created tension between the new rich and those who did not benefit as much from the boom. Still, rural areas continued to grow, while China's urban-based manufacturing sector, after a decade of Cultural Revolution neglect, had missed out on what was happening in the industrialized world, the robotic revolution.
The fact is that computer control of machine tools was developed right here at MIT by the cooperating effort of the electronics engineers, machine tool principal firms of the US, and the Air Force generals. But they altogether were centrally concerned not with minimizing cost and price, but with making a certain kind of technical accomplishment. The result was that in the 20-year period after that original development, only 3% of the machine tools in use in U.S. industry were computer-controlled, meaning taking advantage of the new technology.
The Japanese were the first to harness robotic technology, but Europeans and Americans eventually followed suit, and this changed the nature of the game for any nation like China trying to catch up. Just as water power and steam multiplied the productivity of workers in the Industrial Revolution, robotics helped make Japan the England of the 20th century, the new industrial giant. And under Deng, China set out to learn from Japan's experience. Shanghai 20th Radio Factory has been one of the most aggressive Chinese enterprises seeking new technology from the West. Shanghai 20th, itself a state factory, has bought a Japanese printed circuit production line to serve both as a manufacturing unit and as a teaching tool. Right next to it, matching the Japanese machine station for station, is a Chinese copy built by reverse engineering, taking the original line apart and reconstructing it from scratch. The new technology has forced Shanghai 20th to adopt unfamiliar strategies to get the most out of their workers. The solvents used in producing printed circuit boards yielded huge volumes of dangerous wastes. This young engineer, Wu Ketong, designed the pollution control system, and it proved efficient enough to be used throughout the Shanghai electronics industry. The design earned Wu a bonus of 900 yuan, about a year's salary, and a reward would have been unheard of under Mao. The cash incentives that became popular as Deng's reform progressed loosened the factory's once iron hold on its workers. So Shanghai 20th schools its workers in the factory's credo. Like many Japanese firms, Shanghai 20th sets out consciously to create a corporate culture that can hold the allegiance of managers and workers alike.
The goals of the factory and the goals of the individual should be in accordance with each other. What we are doing is to let workers know that their individual goals are related to the collective goal, which means the factory's goal. Money and reputation, all those benefits, cannot be separated from the factory's goal.
Okay, now the four departments are finance, accounting, BDP, and administration. Okay, the first function of the finance department.
As expertise replaced ideology as the central virtue in the high-tech sector, enterprises like Shanghai 20th were encouraged to send their managers abroad to learn how to run the modern factories China hoped to import.
Or any excess cash.
It was a willingness to borrow from abroad that neither Mao nor the earlier rulers of China had been willing to contemplate.
To monitor the foreign currency inflow and outflow.
By the late 1980s, with industrial growth running at 10% per year, Deng's program of economic reform seemed an unqualified success. The leaders of China believed that it was possible to import the machines from the West without introducing corrosive ideas from there as well. In practice, that division between Western technology and Western culture was very hard to maintain. The workers at the Meadow factory in Shenzhen can even change jobs. Unprecedented freedom of movement for China. The Meadow factory managers instituted these disco parties as a means of hanging on to skilled workers, the people crucial to China's development plans.
We have ambitions to find markets for our products throughout the world, which means that we should make our own new designs. We don't just want to follow the Japanese, who previously copied their products from other countries. China should have its own future.
Predictably, the consumer electronics boom in China brought with it the consumer values so familiar to the West. The modernization efforts extended beyond consumer goods to the high-stakes arena of big-budget science. The Chinese Space Agency launched its first telecommunications satellite in 1978. And with the Challenger disaster, it began to compete for international contracts to place payloads in orbit. Basic research also moved forward throughout the 80s. When high-temperature superconductors were discovered in 1987, many Westerners were surprised to learn that one of the leading superconducting research laboratories was in Beijing, under the direction of Zhao Zhongxian. Within months after the initial discovery by Swiss scientists, Zhao's laboratory was routinely working with the new superconducting materials. As foreign visitors saw both the laboratories and the city streets of the new China, some observers began to speculate about the possible re-emergence of China. Political scientist Roderick McFarquhar speaking in 1987.
I think that East Asia clearly, Japan, Korea, Singapore and so on, has posed a major economic challenge to the West. And if we're not careful, that could end up in some kind of real confrontation, economic confrontation. I think, however, without China as an integral part of that East Asian challenge, it's never going to be a real political challenge. China alone, it seems to me, with all due respect to Japan, is the one country in East Asia which has the credibility and the self-confidence to provide an alternative political pole of attraction to America and Western Europe.
China's new face was visible wherever one looked. But for the average man or woman in the street, the primary concern seemed to be how to keep the good life going.
Most of the Chinese, they don't care about ideology, and they have to sometimes listen to what the party tells them about those ideas, and when they have to, they will repeat the same words, but that's not what's really driving them. They're driven by the opportunities to improve their own lives, to test new freedoms, to try out new styles, to find new kinds of technology, to learn more about the outside world, and that has very little to do with ideology.
The leadership didn't object to such ideological unconcern, so long as the Chinese people confined their interest in things Western to innocuous pastimes. But in 1986, the students of Beijing directly challenged the party's authority. In demonstrations sparked by the threatened removal of popular party chairman Hu Yaobang, the students called for major political reform. The movement was outlawed, and on this occasion the protesters went home. But between the students and the Communist Party, the rift deepened. Speaking to Nova the next year, dissident astrophysicist Fang Liji explicitly confronted the government.
Of course, China needs Western technology badly, and the introduction of high technology from abroad would have a significant influence on China, at least an economic impact. The introduction of Western technology has influence on other aspects because high technology has close links with the culture and system from which it comes. The introduction of technology would play an important role in China's progress. But if the current Chinese system is not changed accordingly, it will be impossible to absorb the high technology.
I think the technologists really are the leaders of China's movement to have a more open society. They're the ones that have had the most sustained contact with the West. They understand better than anyone else how technological change and social and cultural change are part of the same package, and therefore they're the leaders in providing sort of the kinds of breakthroughs that are needed to modernize the country. Unfortunately, they may be moving a little bit too fast, or at least faster than the bureaucracies are willing to move on its own.
Such views now seem prophetic. The death of Progressive Party Chairman Hu in 1989 was the spur that prompted first a demonstration in his memory, and then a month-long occupation of Tiananmen Square by students demanding far-ranging change in every aspect of the Chinese state. The goddess of liberty rose to confront the center of power in China. For several weeks, the government wavered between negotiating with the students and sending in the troops. Then, on June 4th, the uncertainty came to an end. Heavily armed soldiers entered the square, and in the clashes that followed, an estimated 1,000 Chinese died. The next several days saw acts of extraordinary individual courage. But the central government tightened its hold on the situation, denying reports of a massacre and arresting all the participants they could find.
I guess I wasn't surprised by what had happened. Again, you couldn't have predicted that some people were going to be shot and that tanks were going to be rolled out. Nonetheless, you always knew that the Chinese leadership was not going to accept the challenge to their leadership that was posed by the intellectuals and the students. Clearly, politics was in command in China, and that's something that Chairman Mao said should be the case, and I think that's something that's going to continue to be the case for a long time, and the scientific community is just not going to be able to make a breakthrough in terms of undoing the paramount position of politics in the system.
Chinese science immediately felt the chill. Dr. Zhao had planned his conference on superconductivity for 2 years, but Western researchers boycotted the meeting, a sign of the renewed isolation that China now faces.
In my view, Deng Xiaoping is a tragic figure. He did immense good for his country by unleashing the peasantry and transforming, or beginning to transform, the urban economy. But he'll be remembered as the butcher of Tiananmen Square. I think that his great mistake was not to realize that the political system had been gravely eroded by the blows which Mao dealt it during the Cultural Revolution, and that his own economic reforms, Deng's, had further eroded the legitimacy of its political authority. And as a result of that erosion, when the crunch came and the students and the citizens went on the streets in their hundreds of thousands, the system had no more resources to deal with it. And in the end, only a military solution was possible.
Far from the battles of the capital, Chinese peasants tend their fields as they did 1,000 years ago. The Great Wall still stands, a memory in stone of vanished glory. China retains its ancient monuments, its history of extraordinary accomplishment. But for centuries, the pressure of the new has cast China into turmoil again and again. Mao still watches over Tiananmen Square, but the battle within continues.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.